Hey there, listeners. If you're someone who is pushing back and are looking for like-minded people to connect with, consider joining the Pushback Talks Patreon. It's a great way to support the podcast and gain access to people from around the world pushing for change. Join us to see what lessons we can learn from each other and how we can work together to achieve our aims. This week on Pushback Talks, Fredrik and Leilani sit down to consider the question, what if you could put the business of landlordism on trial? Nick Bano does just that in his book, Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis. Bano, who is a barrister specializing in representing homeless people, residential occupiers, and destitute and migrant households, takes us through the UK's history with housing law from the Victorian era through World War II to present day, revealing the ways that housing law in the UK took a turn toward the unaffordable in the mid-20th century and never looked back. Now, in 2024, the UK housing market is seeing skyrocketing rents as the result of state-backed rent raising. 1 in 21 people in the UK is now a landlord, meaning landlords outnumber teachers 4 to 1. In this episode, Fredrik, Leilani, and Nick explore the implications of making landlordism a lucrative and protected industry, how making the business of housing unprofitable will push us to better address the housing crisis, and just how close Britain came to abolishing landlords altogether. This is Pushback Talks.
I'm Fredrik Curtin, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks, and we are back again. And we are now past like 100 episodes. I think it's 106, 107. We started during the pandemic. And now, friends tells us that we need to tell our listeners that they should interact, they should write comments. Have you been doing that? Have you been telling your friends?
I have not. But when I do presentation speeches, that kind of thing, I have been promoting the podcast, but I don't tell people to put in comments, to rate us.
Rating is important, I've heard. Yeah, so you should rate the podcast. And also, we have an update. We just put out the podcast also on YouTube podcasts.
Super exciting.
Yeah, it is. It is.
That's where all podcasts are now, for some reason, on YouTube.
We are under these big guys are running also this world, and we are like just a little fly, and which makes. The cool thing is that we can reach out. We don't make any money, and probably they'll make money out of us, but what the heck? We're doing our best.
We are. And we remain ad-free. We have not succumbed.
No. And that's
ad-free.
You listen to podcasts where like serious people are reading out, selling cars or stupid things,
Airbnb gets a lot of advertising.
Horrible. But we have a guest. And it's a man that I read in The Guardian is labeled as Britain's top Marxist housing lawyer. Top Marxist housing lawyer. Nick Bano, welcome to Pushback Talks.
Thanks so much. And I should say that the other Marxist housing lawyer is very cross about that. So
that's right. You two are competing.
Yeah.
So there are two Marxist top lawyers, and it's and I know that Marx had lived. I actually went to his birthplace in Trier, Germany, a long time ago, but I haven't read a lot, or maybe nothing. But when I opened your book, you actually start with a quote from Marx. Poverty is a more fruitful source for house rent than the silver mines of Potosi were for Spain. One section of society here demand a tribute from the other for the very right to live on the earth. So Leilani, what do you say about that?
Wow.
It is kind of spot on.
It's spot on. I'm going to say right at the top that I'm really happy that Nick self-identifies as a Marxist, because it means I don't have to. Nick and I agree on a lot of things. Our framework is very similar. Our understanding of the way this all works is really compatible. But he calls himself a Marxist, so I don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice to be among friends. And, you know, I think what's really kind of liberatory about it is that you start from a completely different place. And I think most of the time when people talk about economics and conceive of economics, it's about the allocation of scarce resources. And Marx does it the other way around. He says we live in a world of abundance. We live in a world of plenty. Why is it that we're all struggling and then we're all poor? So when you apply that to housing, you look around cities and they are just packed with housing. There is so much housing in the world. And the question is, why do none of us have anywhere to live despite that abundance? And
this is the title of your book is kind of also pointing in some kind of direction against landlords. How to solve the housing crisis. We are solving it in one way is going against the landlords.
Funnily enough, I mean, the title wasn't the book I set out to write. That wasn't the aim. That wasn't the project. And it was aimed to be a much more kind of multifaceted analysis of how the housing crisis in Britain works. But as I got deeper into it and started thinking more and more about it, there was this kind of irresistible conclusion that everything really sits on top of rented housing. And the way in which rents aren't just allowed to rise, but forced to rise, is what seems to be pushing up the cost of housing across the board more broadly. So it's come out with this quite strident conclusion, which really puts all the blame for human misery on the system of landlordism, rather than on the kind of supply and demand, foreign investment accounts that we're more used to seeing.
There's a lot there. I want to go back a little bit if we can. I love the framing, the Marxist framing of which debunks the kind of classic economics supply demand, which you said, Nick. In other words, we're not going to build our way out of a housing crisis, build. In fact, there is a lot of existing building. And the problem is, how is that being allocated and for whom and to what end? And that, I mean, if I get clobbered ever, which I do on social media, it's when I try to puncture the classic economic supply-demand argument. And I've been saying this for Fredrik knows I'm like a broken record, for many, many, many years. Like, excuse me.
Not broken, it's just a record.
Yeah, therein lies the problem, a record. It's amazing how all the, I would call them neoliberal trolls, will come out and it's a lot of, with due respect, white men saying to me, what are you talking about? You don't know anything about economics. And here you are, Nick, in your book saying really clearly, maybe this is not, well, you don't even say maybe, you say this is not about supply.
Yeah,
there is an abundance of supply.
Well, that's fascinating, and I'm glad to be taking some of the heat off you for a few minutes because they're coming for me instead. But I think what's really fascinating about it is how fragile they feel. I think if they really thought we were talking nonsense, they would just ignore us. If they really thought we didn't know anything about economics, they would just ignore us. But very, very prestigious think tanks are having to come out and deal with this argument, which on the one hand is just very funny because I'm sort of a nobody with a book by Karl Marx. But on the other hand, it's like, it shows you how they are really worried that people will start to think correctly about it and will start objecting to the way in which they produce housing.
Yeah, and this is where we are constantly battling against this argument. And I mean, we met a conservative politician in London when we were shooting Push. He didn't never end in the film, but he was arguing that the industry building apartments and selling apartments in London was like the Chinese are making iPhones. It's like this is what we are good at. This is like our export industry is apartments in London. And he seriously made that like a point. There is the demand for people to invest in apartments in London. So we export that.
Yeah, and I think the terrifying thing is that he's sort of right. If Britain has a national industry now, it's house prices, domestically and abroad. And what that means is that to do the things we need to do to fix the housing crisis here, i.e. to bring rents down, to cool markets off, that's a big, big threat to the national economy more broadly. So we're really stuck in the UK, and we're between a rock and a hard place that we need to puncture this for the welfare of the people here. But if we do that, we do threaten Britain's economy more broadly.
And Nick and Leilani, when I hear, because when you mention Marx, I think, okay, that's like 150 years ago. But then when we see what happens in the UK now, but also broadly around the world, we have more people sleeping rough. We have poor people struggling every month to pay the rent. I mean, you mentioned in the book that like a big group of the UK poor are paying more than half of their money to rent. So I mean, it's we're in some way we're back to this Oliver Twist days, you know. It's like and it seems to be obvious for most of us that something has to be done because the stress in society is huge. So where are we going, Leilani and Nick?
I'll give the floor to Nick. Where are we going?
Well,
and where have we come from? I mean, it's not just, the days of Marx, right? In your book, and I thought this was super interesting, you link it, of course, to Margaret Thatcher, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, of course, because neoliberalism has its roots there, and we've talked about that a fair bit here. But you go right into Tony Blair and his contributions, which a lot of people don't necessarily do. And it would be the same in the States. People talk about Reagan, but they don't talk about Clinton and, or even Obama. I'm interested if you can just talk a little bit about, I mean, you said rents have been forced to rise.
Yeah.
Right. Not that they're just like rising naturally as they would in a free market system, right? You say they have been forced to rise, which suggests laws, policies, programs have contributed to this or something.
Yeah, and I think before we come on to that, if you don't mind, I think Fredrik made a really important point that Karl Marx would recognise the world he sees today. And I think that's important because I think the temptation when we talk about the housing crisis is to think about 2008 and to think about Margaret Thatcher and to think of all these things as very, very new processes of financialisation and speculation. And in fact, when you go right back to the 1860s when Marx is writing, you see that happening as part of the origin story of capitalism itself. So these are much, much older processes. And I think the reason why that's important is because the fact that we know that they're old shows that we can overcome them because we have in the past. So the methods are all there. We just need to reach back into our history and get ourselves out of this mess as we've done in the past. I think you're right, Leilani, but the thing about the kind of continuity neoliberal candidates, because land is a long-term investment, the problem they had throughout most of the 20th century was that right-wing governments would come and loosen up housing and land markets, but they still wouldn't invest because they would know that left-wing governments would come and periodically reverse them. And when you've got a long-term investment like land, that doesn't make much sense. But when you have Thatcher saying, I'm abolishing rent controls, and then you have Blair saying, and I'm never bringing them back, that's what signals to land speculators that this is a really, really solid investment for you. The state's not coming to help people out again. You have the security that your investments need to mature. And on your question about rents being forced to rise, and as you correctly point out, left to their own devices under the market, they will, because rents, they are just as much as a landlord can extract under given social circumstances. And the point, I think, is that the story of the 20th century is states learning that lesson and intervening to put some sort of brake on that process, whether that's through rent controls, whether that's through security of tenure, whether that's through whatever policy they like. They wanted to kind of cool things down. And the story since the 1980s is the deliberate dismantling of that system of braking so that rents resort to their state of nature of gouging as much money as they possibly can. And that's that return to the kind of market that Karl Marx would recognise in the big housing crises that he saw up until about 1880.
Because, I mean, this is like the big circle we're seeing. I mean, the social democrats, the labor movements around the world been fighting to protect tenants, people, so they and give people better quality of housing and better homes and schools, all these good things that in the UK, I mean, with a lot of social housing that are well planned, nice apartments and so on, and also in my own country, Sweden, a lot of that. But of course, what happens with started in Chile. We talked about it already in Push. I mean, the neoliberalism, and that then Thatcher and Reagan came to kind of spread. And then the Social Democrats said, oh, wait, maybe it's true that the power of market is good for society. And they bought into it. We had here on our podcast the Dutch politician Frans Timmermans, who was the vice president of the European Commission. I mean, he said, honestly, yes, we Social Democrats, we were too happy for the market, and we opened the door and we forgot to close it. He was really honest. It was a big mistake. So, and now we are in some point we're getting to the other extreme of that now. So our societies are now looking more like it did when Marx was writing this first quote. So this is like a long turn. So, and when you see the atmosphere out in societies, the stress, the feelings, a lot of people go racist, and so it's kind of the anger gets exploited in wrong directions, of course. But how do we turn all this around? I mean, this is what you are into here, Nick. I mean, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think, again, this is why it's so useful and important to look at recent history. And one of the things that fascinated me researching the book, and I think has been a surprise to a lot of readers, is just how close Britain came to abolishing private landlordism full stop. And there was a point in the mid-70s when it wasn't just declining, and it wasn't just very low, but the pace at which it was declining was accelerating. And the fascinating thing is that everybody agreed that this was a good thing. The right said, well, we don't like landlordism because we prefer people to buy their own homes, and we think landlords are kind of an exploitative class who take wealth without creating any. The left said, well, we think this is a good thing because it allows us to build more social housing because lands are devalued. We also quite like owner-occupiers. Let's drive them out of business, and that's great. And as you point out, Fredrik, this took place at a crucial moment in the mid-70s when that experiment in neoliberalism started. And just when landlord abolition was within our reach, we reversed it. And the reversal was extremely successful. It really, really, really worked. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is if the question is, how do we do this? Where are we going? The answer is, well, that's easy. We've done it in the past. We know that through things like stern rent controls, through things like stern regulation of landlords, which makes the whole business unprofitable, you create the conditions to decommodify land and housing, to allow public authorities to acquire land much more cheaply, to provide public housing, to allow owner-occupiers to acquire housing much more easily. And if you kind of puncture the system of landlordism that's been so successful at making everything bad, that's how we start to make things good again.
But the political risk for a political party who want to win elections is that a lot of people are invested in the landlordism system. So in my country, it's mainly through people's savings or investments, funds and whatever they call it. And in your country, the UK, it's actually you have, is it 5 million landlords? So people who own maybe 2 apartments or 3 apartments or just one extra that they rent out. Like, that's my saving for my retirement. I have an extra apartment. So there's a lot of people who are invested in the system. They might be nice people or ugly people. It doesn't really matter. But what you're talking about will mean that they will also lose. Or is there a win-win somewhere?
No, it's a very astute point. And the stat that comes out of the book is here in Britain, 1 in every 21 adults is a landlord. We have 4 times as many landlords as teachers. It's obscene. And you're right to point out that we are all very, very invested in that system because we know people who are landlords by the nature of that statistic. And obviously we don't want them to fail financially. And obviously you're also right that the reason they do it is because we've had a long system of falling wages, of crumbling public services, of poor pensions, and that kind of landlordism and house prices more broadly are basically a bulwark against what would otherwise be a very, very poor standard of living. So you're right that we're between a rock and a hard place. We've got Hobson's choice. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, which of these courses of action is worse? Do we continue to watch the housing crisis unfold, the spiraling human misery, children growing up in worsening poverty, children growing up in total lack of security? Or do we stop that, but necessarily put at risk the pensions and care support systems that people have built for themselves over decades? It's a really difficult question, and yeah, it's one that I wish we didn't have to answer, but we do.
No, and we talked about that before also with children waking up hungry in the UK without breakfast, like the million, was it 2 million hungry kids in the UK every day? It's like, it's insane.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm with Nick in terms of the lack of sustainability. I mean, it's not sustainable to continue to create gross inequality through housing. And the suffering on the low end of things is real. And I'm sure Nick has many stories to tell us about his clients that he's represented who are really suffering. I mean, you know, in my work, in my daily work, we talk about housing as being a matter of life and death, or life or death, I should say. And we see that on a daily basis in many different contexts. So it's clear that we're not on a sustainable path. Nick's suggestions around, you know, legal reform, for example, regulation, may be painful, but I think it's time. The gravy train has been running, as I call it, for a very long time. And these landlords, whether they're an individual landlord or a corporate landlord, have been on a gravy train supported by states for a long time. And so, I mean, I think the way forward is to incrementally bring these things in a way that the pain is meted out over time. And so you don't have to feel the sticker shock or whatever, you know, tomorrow it all happens, but bring it in gradually over 5 to 10 year period, reforms that then gravitate people away from housing as a pension fund, away from housing as a way to make a living, and redirect them to other ways of profit making if that's what they want, but leave housing to what it is, which is home, a human right, a social value, a social good, etc. But, you know, I propose all of this as well, and Nick, I'll make sure you get a copy. In the Shift Directives, we will do a little series of podcasts on this body of work that my team and I created called the Shift Directives, which is to redirect policies and laws to better protect tenants and to move investors out of housing, basically.
Yeah, how do you see this, Nick? How do we make this shift without getting the army on the streets?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think Leilani's right. Enough is enough. And I think one of the interesting ways of conceiving of that is the housing, what we in Britain we call the housing benefit bill. So this is state spending on landlordism. And where we are now is roughly 25 billion. So there are only that single item of state spending. There are only 3 entire government departments that have budgets bigger than that single item of state spending. And you sort of start to wonder why the IMF doesn't get involved and say this is obscene that Britain is spending all this public money on landlordism. So if you want to look at it from the perspective of management of capitalism, it's indefensible. I think you're right that we need to be cautious, and I think that happens naturally anyway. And I think one of the interesting things about how this phenomenon unfolded is that, you know, Thatcher deregulated the private rented sector at a stroke in the late 1980s. It's sort of taken 30, 35 years for landlords to turn that legal possibility into the sustained economic reality. And I think the reverse would probably happen. So if we brought in rent controls, tenant protections tomorrow, it would take years, if not decades, for landlordism to crumble and for tenants to realise their new economic power. So I'm not sure that anything would happen overnight, even if we wanted to. But it's a dangerous game, and you know it's a worry for everyone.
Well, and the forces, well, and Fredrik and I can talk about the forces at play when you do try to do what you're suggesting, Nick, which is, for example, rent control. Fredrik, you'll remember the episode of the podcast we did with Renee Moya out of California regarding Proposition
21.
What was it?
21.
Proposition 21. Which was, Nick, I'm not sure if you know, but they were lobbying, and they will continue. They'll keep bringing this proposition up to have in California, in all cities in California, some kind of rent control. And Fredrik, you'll remember who came out, our favorite friend, and it gets a mention in Nick's book.
Of course, the one that some stone who is dark. Dark stone, Blackstone, yeah. Our friends
and comrades, yeah.
They poured, I forget how many millions, but millions into the no rent control campaign.
Yeah.
And they won, basically, through their might and their money. But just to say that I agree with you that the crumbling will take a long time anyway, even if we do win and get these really important laws in place.
But let's be specific. To both of you, a question. There is election coming up in the UK. It looks like in the polls that the Labour will take power. You never know. So what would be your advice to them, a new housing politics? Both of you. Well, Nick first, of course, you are the guest.
Well, I think the way you sell it to them is that it's not a new housing politics, it's an old housing politics. Let's restore the system we had throughout most of the 20th century. Otherwise, you're no better than Thatcher. And I think what's interesting is we have a kind of microcosmic experience of this in Scotland, which tends to have more progressive policies than much of the UK. And one of the things they did was bring in a temporary rent freeze as a cost of living measure. Very, very popular in Scotland, very effective in Scotland. And sadly, it's falling apart now. But I think national government could learn a lot from that experience of saying, look, tenants are suffering and they really like this. Let's experiment with that. I also think, maybe there's a case for... the Labour Party is very, very right-wing, but there are lots of right-wing arguments against landlordism and trying to invoke those, why isn't the IMF concerned? Why are we content with all of this state spending going on economically, these wasteful billions? So I think, I would like to try and come at the Labour Party from the left and say this is a good thing that needs to be done, but maybe it's just as kind of wise to say to them there are good right-wing arguments for this too.
So, Leilani, be better than Thatcher. That's the first advice. What is your...
I guess one of the things I've been saying to governments recently is, are you getting value for the money you are spending? So what value... So this housing benefit, for example, and its billions and, largest line item across ministries or whatever. So, what value are you getting, and trying to get governments to understand that they're not getting good value for their money. They're not getting social value. They're getting more rough sleeping, which creates a kind of disgruntled society as well, right? No one I've met actually likes homelessness. Whether it's people living in homelessness or the people walking by people living in homelessness. And yes, there's a lot of hatred toward homeless people. I recognize that, of course. But also there is a growing sense that, wait a second, does it have to be like this? I don't want to live in a city where there's homeless people everywhere. I want to live in a city where people are happy and where people are properly housed. And so trying to get governments to understand that there are other ways to spend their money, that they can spend the same money but have better outcomes that make cities better places to live. So that's what I've been trying to run. I can't say I've been successful yet, but I'm going to keep going with it. I did have a politician here in Canada, not a politician, someone within the housing minister's office. I could see his eyes were alight. Now, he's a young guy, but I could see his eyes were alight when I said, are you getting value? They just attributed $1 billion to a homelessness program that hasn't really proved successful. I said, are you getting value for that money? Don't you want to get better value? And I could see something twigged with him. So
you're speaking, it's about picking the right words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can hear that. Yeah. Nick.
Yeah, it's great that you've learned to speak their language. It's an admirable skill. I think that's right, and I think they would all love to be the party that solves homelessness. I think for cynical electoral reasons or for reasons of pure humanity, if they can walk away from office and say, look, homelessness has visibly decreased, that would be great. But, the way to do that is by bringing in security of tenure in the private sector. It's by bringing in rent controls in the private sector. And if they're serious about it and not just serious about the aesthetics of it, then they've got to do difficult, necessary things.
Mm.
Yes, and I mean that's of course the rub for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
it is true. You've called me out. What I tend to do is dress up rather radical solutions in language that is more palatable to these guys, and they are mostly guys. One of the things I've been pushing, for example, I'm interested in your opinion, Nick, is actually talking about the role of, we have a lot of corporate landlords in this country, in Canada, a lot, and real estate investment trusts, actually, and trying to suggest to government that for the tax break that these guys get, they should have to give up a certain percentage of their entire portfolio to social housing, existing portfolio and future portfolio. And it's not I'm not talking about inclusionary zoning. I'm talking about they have to give up some of their units, I would say, at least 10%, maybe 20% of their units to social housing. And I don't talk about how that would work, whether they would sell them off or whether they would be state owned or whether they would continue ownership, but they'd have to run them at a low cost rent. That's a radical proposition. I don't get very far with that proposition. But I'm wondering if you think it's not radical enough.
No, I think it's great. I think the problem with it is that these guys have lines of defence. And I think if you talked your government into bringing that in, then your friendly local investment trust will start looking over the sea to what's happening in the UK, where often you have local authorities only granting permission to build on the basis of a social housing carve-out. And what inevitably happens is they get halfway through the project and say, listen, we've had a think, it's not feasible, we need to revise the deal. And the state always rolls over and says yes. And so I think, fine, it's a great idea, but we need to make sure it's really, really robust. In the same way that, rent controls, whenever we talk about them, people say, oh, well, they don't work, they failed here, they failed there. And the answer to that is, well, okay, let's make them better. Let's make them much, much more effective. That's not an argument about rent controls being bad in general. That's an argument about that example not working. So I think it's a nice idea as long as you learn the lessons of Britain as well and make sure that it's ironclad.
Yeah.
This is something we addressed also in Push, and we had in the previous podcast with David Ireland from World Habitat about Haygate Estate and Elephant Park in the London also, where they were supposed to have like a big percentage of social housing. In the end, it was washed out of the plans, and now it's a big Airbnb area in London. Anyway,
it's a hellish place to be. It's just, it's tiny, tiny flats built very badly on government subsidised schemes for more money than you can possibly imagine. And it's an awful place.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's speculative capitalism, and they're not building a city. They're not interested in building a space for human beings or building a community. It's just exporting housing to the market. It's weird, but I understand that that's how extreme it has gone. Nick, let's go into your. I like this, being a lawyer representing tenants. Before I started to do Push, or one of the stories that kicked me in that direction was that my own daughter. She moved to London, and she was living with 3 Swedish girls, and they were all working in different spaces, as you could do before Brexit. Kids could go to London and work. And one day, the landlord is inside the apartment, opened with a different key, and kicks her out to the street. She calls me crying. He's kicking me out to the street. And, this kind of extremely brutal landlord, slumlord.
Yeah.
And I posted it on Facebook so anybody can help her overnight. It was that feeling. But what I got in it, where I got help from friends, but I also got a lot of stories. So I could see this is something that is happening, and we also got tips to find lawyers who could help her. So this is your job.
Yeah, and I'm obviously happy to talk about the people I represent, but I think almost the more interesting question is the people I don't represent, because the private rented sector here is so bad that there's almost never a defence to an eviction case. So we just don't take them on. All the landlord has to do to evict someone here is fill in a form and give them 2 months' notice. So the vast majority of my cases are not private landlord cases, simply because there is nothing to litigate. You can make people homeless at the drop of a hat. And I think what's really interesting about your daughter's case is that this problem with illegal evictions and bullying landlords used to be quite common in the 1970s, up to the 1970s, 1980s, where tenants had quite strong protections, and the only way to bother them was to illegally bother them. So there used to be quite a lot of these sorts of things going on in these sorts of cases. What's surprising about your daughter's case is that kind of stopped because tenants have so few protections now that there's almost no point in doing anything illegal. If you want to evict someone to jack the rent up, or if you just want to jack the rent up, you just do it. There's nothing to stop you. So it's actually not very common to see this kind of gross, unlawful activity, simply because what the state allows landlords to do is so gross anyway that there's simply no point. I'm really sorry to hear that she went through that, and I hope she's doing okay now.
I think the idea there was because these foreign girls who kind of rent an apartment, they force them to pay in a deposition for half a year. And the way of getting them out was, to actually steal the deposition and get new people in. That was the whole plan. So it's
running a scam. Yeah,
a total scam. Yeah,
yeah. And I think that the state. I mean, the way the housing market works here is the state has kind of promised landlords a license to print money, and they just act with this sort of entitlement that I can have as much money as I want, and then I can evict you as much as I want. So it's kind of unsurprising to find a landlord who has that attitude of I can just extract and then do violence, because that's the kind of fundamental basis that the state has set up for landlordism in Britain.
So that's the next thing for your new Labour government, is to take some power away from the landlords. Is there a legal? Can you write that little new legislation?
It shouldn't be difficult because, as I say, it was the prevalent legislation for much of the 20th century. It's the pre-Thatcher settlement, and what's really interesting is that Thatcher dismantled that with the explicit aim of luring landlords back to the private rented sector. It really, really worked, and a few years ago there was a human rights challenge to the system of landlordism in Britain, because it was a case about a very, very vulnerable tenant who just had absolutely no defence because the Thatcher laws promised the landlord the property back. And the courts examined it and said, no, this legislation is compatible with domestic and international human rights obligations. So as a lawyer, it makes me slightly unconfident about relying on human rights frameworks as our kind of saving grace, because that can be a frustrating process. Okay,
Leilani.
No, I'm still going to rely on international human rights law.
Yeah,
Were you going to ask me?
Of course you will. Now we're going to talk about fighting back, pushing back. I mean, it's the name of our podcast. We are pushing back.
We are, yeah.
So Nick and Leilani, this is about organizing tenants. It's about getting people out there and pushing for change. We have seen that in Berlin. We've seen it in other places where actually people get organized. How is this happening, and how can we be a part of that?
I asked Nick. I don't know what the movements are like in the UK. Of course, I know there's a tenants union, for example, and I really think there's a lot to be said for what tenants unions can achieve and how important they are. I've seen them, of course, in Madrid. We had the Madrid Tenants Union on our show. We've seen the impact of the folks in Berlin. In your book, you note that the Berliners in some way drove Blackstone out of Berlin to some degree.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Is it a nascent movement? Do you feel the tremble on the ground?
Yeah, I'm really proud of them. And I look at them with such admiration, particularly given how little security we have and how much they have to lose. I think what's really interesting, we were talking just before we started recording about the Renters Reform Bill, which is slowly being gutted as it makes its way through Parliament. But the fact that there is a Renters Reform Bill at all is a testament to the housing movement, because we simply weren't having these conversations 7 or 8 years ago. And there's been this groundswell of a housing movement in the UK. That's what put this kind of legislation as a demand in the 2019 general election. It's a demand that the Labour Party made, and then all the other parties felt the need to match. And I think that you can draw a very, very strong line between people getting organised and educating each other and making demands, and the legislation which we may one day end up seeing. And it's really, really encouraging. And yeah, as you say, Berlin driving back Blackstone out, they're kind of 4 or 5 conversations ahead of us. And that's the conversation. That's the battleground we want to be fighting on in 5 years' time. And it's wonderful to see that as well.
Fredrik, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll let you in.
Well, I'm interested to know, I mean, in your book, you weave the Grenfell experience, and that's where Fredrik was going to go to. The tragedy of Grenfell is woven throughout your book. And I mean, there's a lot of lessons and insights one can glean from Grenfell. You mention something that doesn't get mentioned too often in the UK context, but also in the European context generally, which is racism and the way in which, I think you say Grenfell is like the new colonialism or an example of colonialism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. We've covered Grenfell a fair bit in this podcast.
Yes.
Fredrik filmed it.
And I filmed there really early on and met the people and saw the images of the people who were lost in the building. And you can totally see that this was a different part of town, that building.
Well, that's it. And I think myself and a lot of my friends actually still can't really see those images of the mass grave in the sky. I mean, we were too close and it was too awful for us to even conceive of. So we still find it quite difficult. I think what really kind of prompted me to write about the race aspect was I think there's quite a respected and well understood literature about racism in, for example, the US and housing, where redlining is quite well understood. London and Britain works completely differently, because if you think about where Grenfell was and who lived in Grenfell, it was wealthy and poorer people, racialised and non-racialised people living on top of each other, sometimes in the same building. And Grenfell and buildings like it were built as social housing, which had its own racial dynamics, but were privatised under Thatcher. And some of them have become quite desirable. So you have in the very same building fashionable modernist architecture flats with well-to-do people living in them. Directly upstairs, directly next door, you would have a social housing tenant who's there because they really, really need social housing. So the fact that the way in which the racialised poor are melded with whiter, wealthier people in London makes you need to understand its racism on its own terms. And you made a point. And
some other people renting, in a second, third hand, paying extreme amounts of money to somebody who happened to own an apartment or having a contract or whatever. So it's...
Yeah. Exploitation at several steps removed. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
And you made a point a minute ago, Fredrik, about race being a very, very easy electoral card to play when the chips are down. And we've certainly seen that in Britain. We've certainly seen the Labour Party under Starmer reach for racist rhetoric when it comes to housing, because it's just so easy. And I think, again, that's why, Leilani, you're doing such good work with the supply and demand argument, because for as long as we conceive of the housing crisis as shortage, then necessarily we're involved in a conversation as to who is and ought to be entitled to housing. And it's only by completely messing that up and saying, no, there is enough to go around, that we can begin to call ourselves anti-racist in the housing context.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. I think I think it's super important. And I feel like everywhere I go, the race dimension is there and one of the less talked about aspects to all of this. So a big thanks to you for including that so firmly throughout the book, but also in a very particular chapter too. So, yeah.
Yeah, but
lots to contend with.
Yes.
And I mean, the story of Grenfell in and Notting Hill in Push is the story of a community where, you know, that created its own culture, you know, the carnival and everything, and suddenly they're all kicked out, except for a few social housing estates, you know. Then the rest is like, sorry, it's a takeover again, you know.
It's really odd. And I've got this really kind of striking memory of 2 or 3 days after the fire when there was a big kind of community support rally and we marched from the town hall to the site. And it was the middle of Ramadan. It was a hot day. And like the community was kind of checking on each other. Neighbours were handing out food to well-wishers who'd come. And you could see this kind of very, very well self-cared for working class community. And in the middle of all that's going on, like the poshest man I've ever seen just cycled through on his way from buying a newspaper, wearing kind of glaring red chino shorts and a copy of the Daily Telegraph. But that's because he lives 40 seconds away. Yeah. That's because the city is built, you know, it's the city in the city living on top of each other. And that's why it's such a kind of anxious dynamic in Britain.
Yeah. One of the things I'll just add about Grenfell, which you highlight, was just the fact that certain people in our society are not listened to. They knew the cladding was problematic. They had done their due diligence as tenants in the building. They were concerned with the cladding, and no government official, no one with any power was willing to listen to them and willing to put the people's concerns and their lives, we now know, ahead of the economics of the matter and the aesthetics of the matter, right?
Yeah.
And that's a story, you know, that's on repeat in every community I go to. It's
around
the poor
the world.
People around the world. Yeah.
I mean, we had the same story
racialized.
in Valencia, Spain recently with the same kind of cladding problem, a big fire. So this is something that happens.
Yeah, and they were absolutely right. And I think something that chimes really well with the work you're doing is there's a brilliant bit in Pete Apps's book about Grenfell, Show Me the Bodies, where in the Grenfell inquiry, one of the senior civil servants for the building industry, his contemporaneous emails from sort of a few years before the fire, they're talking about whether there should be a legal requirement to install sprinklers in buildings. And he says, well, I don't think this would be very good for UK PLC. You know, the business case was really important for the national economy. And he was cross-examined on this after the fire, years after austerity and neoliberalism had been, made a mockery of. And he still said, yeah, look, I'm really concerned that if we regulate the building industry for safety, the country will go bankrupt. And on the one hand, you're like, what on earth is wrong with you? This is ghoulish. But on the other hand, you're like, the success of neoliberalism is convincing people like that pivotal civil servant of their messaging. And you just wonder what would have to be done for that civil servant and those like him to have a completely different conception of what the state's for and how it ought to work. And surely that's got to be our political ambition, is to reverse the kind of psychological voodoo that's been done on these people and to build a better world through that.
And to leave Thatcher behind. Yeah. Maybe that's time to do that. Friends, I think we are touching almost 50 minutes, so I think our listeners have probably to step to another train or to or to go home.
Or to go to the lawns.
Yeah, or to do something nice. Yeah, or to go out. You can walk your dog and listen to podcasts. So don't blame that. But I mean,
oh no, I was talking about the political lawns, Fredrik.
The political lawns.
Yes.
I thought you were all about dog walking.
Well, there's that too.
No, the student protests around the world are extremely interesting, and it's almost like a new Vietnam movement boiling. And remember, Black Lives Matter was like the biggest protest in the US, and that's only 4 years ago, and now it's happening again. And every time the power are not expecting it, the media is not expecting, and it happens anyway.
But it's related to what Nick just said too. Things, it's like, okay, so how did that official drink the Kool-Aid and just believe what he was saying? We're seeing this moment in time, the basis upon which so many communities and societies are built is crumbling. People are starting to see a new truth, starting to see how the world is structured. And it's pretty big. And I'm hoping that that will come to the housing world too, that the truths will start really emerging, that people won't be afraid to just start saying, well, I'm questioning this. I'm questioning, because that's what these students are doing, right? They don't have all the answers. They don't know everything, but they're like, wait a second. How is the world working right now? How is my university contributing to some pretty bad stuff? It's an interesting moment.
It is, Nick, isn't it?
Yeah, and in many ways, it's very, you're right. It's heartwarming to see this politicization, this refusal to take kind of client journalism seriously anymore and say, no, this is a genocide, and we have a moral duty to do whatever we can to stop it.
Yeah, it's amazing. But I do think it will have ripple effect. I think young people are the courage, they're literally so courageous. They are staring at horses that are there to trot on them and to intimidate them. And they're chanting, "You don't scare us."
Don't bully us.
We need that in the housing world. We need that in the housing world.
So thank you very much for taking part of our podcast, Nick. Really inspiring. And I hope everybody goes and buys your book, Against Landlords, How to Solve the Housing Crisis.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and keep up the good work. It's wonderful to see what you're doing.
We are trying, but we have fun, so that's good.
Yeah. And I shall be using your work, Nick, in many speeches going forward, so thank you. No, and I'm serious about that. So
I'm really glad to hear that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work in representing tenants in the UK.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye now.
Thanks, Fredrik.
Thanks, Leilani.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.